Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, I'm not going to be playing any guitar whatsoever in this video, which might be a real relief for some of you to hear. No, today is going to be a much more technical, nerdy, deep dive into the world of YouTube audio. Now, you might have seen that last month I made a video showing you how I record my guitars for use in gear demos, and that was largely in response to a thread that was going on the gear page, where a lot of people were getting very angry about many things to do with the world of YouTube gear demos. But one thing in particular stood out to me, which was people saying, I've got no idea how YouTubers tweak their audio in the post-mix to make a pedal, for example, sound better than it is. It's very misleading and people are doing all sorts of trickery to Connors. So hopefully that video showed you that, for me at least, what you hear is 4 microphones coming out of your speakers. There is no post-production trickery happening whatsoever. You are hearing raw audio. Now, another thing that kept coming up on that thread, and this is something I've had in my own YouTube comment sections many times over the years, is people saying things such as, I've got no idea what this pedal sounds like because of YouTube compression. I've got no idea what I'm actually listening to because YouTube audio is so terrible. And that's something that's always confused me a little bit, because when I listen to the raw audio playing back from Pro Tools and then listen to the final video streaming on YouTube, it never sounds too different, and at least it's very equivalent. Unless you're flicking between them, you can't hear any difference whatsoever. And yet this comment keeps coming up. People are saying, because YouTube compression, YouTube demos are completely pointless. So today I wanted to look into YouTube compression. What is it? And if it exists, does it mean that all YouTube gear demos aren't to be trusted? Now, the first very obvious problem I'm going to run into today is that everything you're listening to in this video is, by definition, uploaded to YouTube. So I can't take some raw audio and some YouTube audio, flick between it and go, can you hear the difference? Because by definition, that raw audio is uploaded to YouTube and processed in order for you to hear it. So I'm going to have to try and find a backdoor way into discussing this topic today. And I've done a lot of thinking on this, and the way I've settled on doing it is using a very basic fundamental concept from physics, which is phase. Now, if you've ever tried to run a wet-dry guitar rig, for example, or even just 2 amps at the same time, you'll have almost certainly run into phase and the problems it can create. Because if you have 2 guitar amps, for example, and one's out of phase with the other, those speakers aren't going to be working together. They're going to be fighting against each other. And your 2 very thick, meaty sounding amps won't sound very good. Or if you're running a wet-dry rig and you stand on a pedal that then flips the phase of one of the amps, your big, thick, thumpy sound all of a sudden sounds quite thin and weird. And that's because of phase problems. So what I've done is, in Pro Tools here, I have an unmastered mix of a song I put out back in December. And the reason it's unmastered will become apparent later on in the video. But I'm going to play it a little bit to you just so you can hear what it sounds like in its kind of pure form. So it will sound quieter than what you might have downloaded because it's unmastered, and one of the main reasons for mastering a song is to bring it up to commercial volume, so that hasn't been done. But otherwise it sounds like hopefully a pretty decent mix. Now, what I'm going to do is throw a plugin onto here called Manipulator, which I believe is a free plugin from memory. And what this lets me do is flip the polarity or the phase of either the left or the right channel. So all of a sudden the left and the right in your headphones or on your speakers that are working together, or at least they should be in a well-mixed song, will be working against each other. And you can hear the effect that has. So when one side is out of phase with the other, all the low end goes away and it sounds like you've got your head in a box and you're sort of tilting your head to one side trying to compensate. It's quite an uncomfortable thing to listen to. And that's because left and right are now out of phase with each other. So we are getting phase cancellation. But what happens if we take two identical pieces of audio and flip the phase of one? So I've got my mix here and I'm just going to duplicate that track. So we now have two absolutely identical, perfectly lined up versions of that song. Now, if I mute one of them and then bring it in, you'll hear something called constructive interference. And basically what that means is you have two identical waveforms on top of each other. So all that will happen is it won't change the sound in any way, it will just get louder because one waveform will add on top of the other and give you more amplitude, volume. So when that second track's brought in, it just gets louder because they're identical, the phase is perfect, and they're adding on top of each other. But if we take two identical pieces of audio and flip the phase of one of them, what happens then? So I'm going to add this plugin on here, which is just a one-band EQ. It's not doing anything at all. I mean, it can, but I'm not dialing anything in. But this little button at the top here lets me flip the phase of that second audio track. So watch what happens if I play them back together and then flip the phase of that duplicate track. Phase cancellation in action. So what's happening there is we have our two identical pieces of audio, but one of them is then fighting against the first. And because they're identical and the volumes are identical and the waveforms are identical, they're cancelling each other out in a perfect way, and we're getting silence. So that's the basic principle that I'm going to use today to compare the YouTube audio to what I have originally uploaded to the platform. So we can get rid of that duplicate mix now, we don't need that. Here I have a version of the audio from Final Cut, which is the movie editing software I use. So I compiled a video of just a static image with the audio, that original unmastered mix as the audio. And I then compiled the video. So here is the audio from that. So in theory, if we throw the one band EQ on there and flip the phase, if that audio that has come out of Final Cut Pro is the same as the mix, we should get silence. If it's not the same, we should still hear something. So Final Cut on its own is not changing the audio in any way. So when I listen back to the video file played locally on my computer, the audio is exactly the same as what has come out of Pro Tools. So let's get rid of the original mix and just deal with the Final Cut audio here. Now, what I've done, as I said, is I compiled a video with the original mix as the audio, and I've uploaded it to YouTube. So here it is, just streaming off YouTube. And if you ever wondered what the inside of a Dr. Z Master looks like, there you go, because I had to put an image on there to make the video file work. So that is on YouTube, and I've then used one of those or two of those services that allow you to rip audio off YouTube into WAV format. Now, two things I need to say here. Firstly, a lot of those websites are notoriously dodgy, and my antivirus software has been working overtime this morning. So I do not recommend you try and explore any of these websites because they do have a habit of trying to install things on your machine. And secondly, do not use any of these services to go onto YouTube, find a banned song, and rip the audio off. It's illegal, don't do it, buy the song, support the artist. All I've used it for today is ripping my own audio back off YouTube, which it won't surprise you to learn I own the copyright for because nobody is stupid enough to sign me. So here in YouTube, I have two rips of that. One using a website called CoConvert and another called Loader. Irrelevant, but two completely independent services that will allow you to download a video as a WAV. So again, if we add a one-band EQ to one of them, if they are exactly the same, we should get silence. If they are in any way different to each other, we should hear something. So they are exactly the same. And the only reason I did that is just in case those websites were adding any encoding trickery of their own when they download the audio. But it looks like they've both downloaded the audio completely independently of each other in exactly the same way. So I think we can hopefully assume, as much as we're able to, that the websites just download the exact audio that is up on YouTube. There's no variables between them. So I'll delete the second one there. Now let's use the same trick. If we play back the Final Cut audio and the rip off YouTube at the same time and flip the phase of one of them, if they're in any way different, we should hear the difference between them and what has been lost through the YouTube compression. So we're definitely hearing something there, aren't we? It's quite quiet, it's quite a subtle effect overall, but I'm hearing a lot of hi-hat, because if you've ever used like a bitrate reducer when you're recording, as soon as you bring it down, you'll know the first thing to suffer is the high end. So we're hearing a little bit of kind of high end loss there, and this kind of like weird, almost like wind noise. If you're on the phone in the wind, that sort of noise low down. So YouTube has definitely changed the audio, hasn't it? And we're listening to what it's lost. So by compressing the file size down and reducing that, that is the effect. It's kind of a yin and a yang. You know, you reduce the file size, but at the expense of losing that information from the audio. Now, as I said, it's the top end frequencies that are suffering the most there. And in a YouTube guitar video, there's not much in a guitar signal above 7 or 8K, maybe slightly more. So if we're losing a bit of cymbal presence up at 15K, it's not going to affect things too much. But it is definitely affecting the audio. Now, if I switch my solo mode here and flip between them, this isn't something that is going to come across on the YouTube audio because that original mix is going to be compressed, but you're just going to have to take my word for this. Flicking between them here on studio monitors, I can hear a tiny bit of that sort of cymbal presence going away on the YouTube rip, but they do sound pretty much the same. And unless you're A-Bing between your original bit of audio and YouTube, you're not really going to hear the difference on that unless you have that original point of reference. It's still representative, it still sounds like the song, it still sounds like decent quality to listen back to. Now, just to get a point of reference here, I have two MP3s, one encoded at quite a high bit rate at 320, and I appreciate that if you're an audiophile there is no such thing as a good quality MP3, but I also have a low quality MP3 which is down at 96. So if I flip the phase of both the YouTube rip and these two MP3s, solo the Final Cut audio and then flick between the YouTube and the two MP3s, whichever has the loudest sound remaining is the one that's losing the most information. So the low res MP3 there is clearly the loudest out of those. Now, the YouTube audio and the high resolution MP3 is pretty equivalent. You can definitely tell that YouTube audio has been encoded in a different format than MP3. I think it's AAC, similar to what you get on like an iTunes download. So it's a different form of encoding. It does sound slightly different and it's losing information in a slightly different way, but it's broadly equivalent. So I think what we can kind of assume from this is that YouTube audio is pretty much the same, as downloading a song on iTunes. Now, if you're an audiophile, you won't want to be doing that. You're going to want to be listening in like high quality WAV or FLAC format, which is fully lossless audio codec, like the highest resolution digital audio you can get pretty much. But for most people out in the world, they're more than happy listening to their favourite song as a higher res MP3 or from iTunes. Nobody really says, I've got no idea what this song sounds like because of iTunes compression. You never ever hear that. And unless you're A-Bing between the original lossless audio and your iTunes download, again, it's going to sound pretty much the same without that A-B as a point of reference. So in terms of quality then, the YouTube compression and that algorithm squashing the file size down, it's losing about as much as encoding it to an MP3, but it's still very representative. That still sounds like my mix, not quite as crisp, not quite as detailed, but it still sounds like the mix. It doesn't sound like a completely different song or a completely different version of the recording. So YouTube audio in terms of quality is still very representative of what I'm uploading, and the quality is perfectly adequate for listening to a gear demo and picking out the similarities and differences of what I'm trying to show in most of my videos. So quality wise, it's not misleading at all, really. But there is another form of compression, which is probably what a lot of people are thinking of when they think of the term compression as guitarists, which is dynamic range compression. Taking the loud bits and turning them down, taking the quiet bits and turning them up, and narrowing that dynamic range. So is YouTube squashing the dynamic range of the audio? Is it like having a compression plugin on the whole thing? Now there is a way to look into this, so I'm going to add a plugin called Dynameter. And what this does is it basically measures the dynamic range of a recording. So if I put this plugin on both of those tracks, here on the left we have the original Final Cut audio, and on the right the YouTube audio. You can see it says at the top there which one it is. And it's quite complicated how this plugin works, but basically all you need to know is this orange number up here, which is currently at 0 because we're not listening to anything, measures the sort of dynamic range between the loudest part of the song and the quietest part in real time. So the higher that number is, the larger the dynamic range. And this is why I'm using an unmastered mix of the song, because in order to make a song up to commercial volume, you naturally have to compress it and reduce the dynamic range. So it's a bit quieter, but we have the maximum dynamics for this part of the experiment. So I'm going to play both of them back at the same time now. Watch the numbers at the top and watch the graphics on screen. If the graphics are wide, then that's more dynamic, and as they get more narrow, that's a dynamic range reducing. So just have a watch and see how they compare to each other. They're pretty much exactly the same. If we look down here at the peak values of that playback just there, that's pretty much exactly the same too. The YouTube is like 0.1 of a dB quieter, probably because of the information that's been lost in the encoding, but they're exactly the same in terms of their dynamic range. No audio, like kind of dynamic range compression, is happening with the YouTube algorithm. So listening back then, it's pretty much the same as listening to an iTunes download versus the original full quality recording. It's still representative, it's still decent quality, it still gives you a very good representation of the sound I have here in the room and the 48K 16-bit WAVs that I'm uploading to YouTube. Yes, it does reduce the quality, but overall, it's like listening to your favourite song on iTunes. Not quite as crisp and detailed as the original kind of full quality studio file, but still absolutely fine for 99% of circumstances. So when people say, I've got no idea what this pedal sounds like because of YouTube compression, it really isn't true. And I think the bigger part of that debate is how the demo person has recorded the audio and put it together. And if they've absolutely cranked an amp and it's really squashing and compressing and distorting, then that might come across as an overly compressed sound, because that's literally what tubes and speakers and power transformers do. They compress, and that's overdrive and distortion. It's probably down to engineering and mixing way more than the YouTube algorithm and it reducing the quality of the audio. So there we are, folks. As I said, it's very difficult to demo this uploading it to YouTube because of course YouTube processes the audio before you hear it, but hopefully using phase and a few bits sort of metering here, we can debunk those two myths of audio quality degrading on YouTube too much and dynamic range compression. It just isn't happening. Now, it might have happened in the past. I'm sure YouTube is always improving its encoding and things like that. So older videos on YouTube, this may have been more of an issue. But now, in 2022, what you're hearing is very, very equivalent and representative to what I'm uploading. It doesn't change it in any overly significant way that affects anything too much. So there we are, folks. As I said, a very nerdy deep dive into this concept, and I've demonstrated it in the best way I possibly can in a YouTube video. Please do comment underneath, folks. Let me know what you think of all this. Do you trust YouTube audio? Do you trust YouTube demo people to give you an accurate representation of how something sounds in the room? I love chatting this all through with you folks in the comment sections. But for now, thank you ever so much for watching, folks. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it does make a big difference when you do that. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.